Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Past the Week with Michael Hassett and my co-host Pat Barry. And we will present to you our topic of the day, which is to basically discussing the ins and outs of the treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, as a follow-up to our last program where we discussed the truce pre the Treaty of 1921. Um, it's a very divisive topic even to this day. You can see the fallout in families. I saw it in my own family. I remember as a small child going to certain houses visiting on a Sunday, and your father would say, "Don't mention politics going in here now. Don't talk about anything. Don't mention politics." One side would be Fianna Fáil, the other side would be Fine Gael. We can see the fallout of it um, on an international scale between our two countries, between Great Britain and our good selves, and particularly the relationship between Northern Ireland, our six counties, and ourselves down through the years. We all grew up with the different periods and episodes of the troubles down through the years, regardless of what generation we are. We all have a memory of not so good times in Northern Ireland and on the border and all that. I myself had granduncles in the Gardaí. They were posted. You see my mother of them being posted on the border in the 1950s during the 1950s campaign.
Yes.
I remember the story being told that one of the IRA people he encountered, I just leave it as encountered, was a neighbour of his from his own village. And, this is from County Limerick, and the two of them up in Monaghan on the border. Like, so he has led a very contentious um, episode in our history, and I think it is a very good topic to explore here now today. The lead up to it, how it came about, the main people on both sides, because I think the characters on both sides and who they were and the personal occupations was involved them and what drove them to do were
Mm.
linked very much to the outcome of the treaty and the politics that was happening behind the actual scenes. So without further ado, Tash, have you any thoughts before we get into it?
Well, I suppose you did say, Michael, it's a part of our history that we're still. You don't hear a lot of discussion. Of course, next year will be 19. It will be 2021. So will be the centenary of the act of signing the treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, to sign on the 6th of December 1921. So we have a whole year to look forward to next year as well as this year. But we're still living with the legacy of the treaty in that part of our country is still occupied by another country. So we're still living the treaty in one sense, you know? And that's the reality
Yeah.
of history, that's the reality of the outcome. We still haven't resolved it 100 years later, which is astonishing.
Well, on that note, and I'm going to jump ahead to a comment I was going to make at the very end of the program, but since you made that comment, um, Arthur Griffith made a very interesting comment to his fellow peers when he came back to Dublin when he was uh, interrogated by the side that went on to be called the anti-treaty side. He said, "I just like I am an Irishman and I will not be a member of the last generation of Irishmen. I saw the signing of this treaty as the first of many and not the last." And Michael Collins would have rephrased it in a more elegant way, where he saw the treaty as a stepping stone to greater unity
Yeah.
and freedom. So that gives a bit of an insight into the psychology of the guys who were pressurized to sign it that night when, like Josh, and we're jumping ahead now, but like they didn't see it as the final piece of negotiations or the final treaty. So did they themselves see there would be another step and another step and another step? And the fact that particularly Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins were the two main negotiators were dead within 9 months of the treaty being signed. Did that eliminate the possibility of a second treaty, a third treaty, negotiations down the road? And if I can throw a hypothesis out there, what if they've didn't found Fianna Fáil. What if Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins did survive and have new political party between them? Because contrary to what Fine Gael think, Michael Collins was never a member of Cumann na Gael. The date before Cumann na Gael was founded, which later rebranded as Fine Gael in 1932 after De Valera defeated Cumann na Gael in the third election of the new Free State.
Yeah.
What would have happened during World War II? We know what happened. We have the facts where Churchill and De Valera, Churchill is supposed to have offered United Ireland and Northern Ireland back to Southern Ireland if we allowed access to the treaty ports that we took back only 2 years previously during the 1937 monarchy crisis. Would Michael Collins have been the pragmatic statesman and taken that way? Because we do know that he offered different terms to Northern Ireland, where he promised them, at the same time he was promising De Valera in Irish Ireland, he was guaranteeing the Unionists in the North that the North would never become part of the South. So we knew we were dealing with a guy that was willing to lie for the greater good of the war in Europe at the time. But would Collins have taken it a different step? Would there have been other negotiations down between the years? We don't know.
We don't know.
What we have is the evidence of what happened.
Yeah.
I'd like to explore it on this program here now and the lead up to it.
Yeah, what we do know, Michael, before you get on, is that it heightens and it demonstrates again the duplicitous political nature of the British politicians again and again and again, and not alone in dealing with Ireland, but wherever they were. So that's a fact in history.
Yes, and most countries where they withdrew from, you can look at any of the countries, particularly post-World War II, India is a great example. Sri Lanka, on a lesser scale, South Africa, they all left divided countries behind them.
And killing and genocide.
Or did they genuinely feel that it was better to keep to, whether they be ethnic, religious, or political groups aside, but they always left the division, the mark of division behind them. So
yes.
That map of division. But that, on that note, the map of division, as in the border between North and South, I will explore here and I will explain to our listeners that wasn't such a big issue, because we all had this idea today that the treaty was all about the border, when it actually wasn't. It was actually more about the oath and staying within the Commonwealth.
Exactly.
So, without much ado, we'll actually, if you don't mind now, I'd like to go in and start exploring the individuals first. Who were the delegation? How did it come about?
Characters.
So you had De Valera, who had gone over to Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, for, as we stated previously, for 4 separate meetings, which came to nothing. There's been really no evidence of really what was discussed at those meetings. What we do know is that he really attained nothing, and in fact he was on his own. There's no witnesses, and Lloyd George was on his own as well. We do know that Lloyd George did describe the meeting as, when he was discussing with Mr. De Valera, the de facto president of the Republic of Ireland, that it was like picking mercury up off a table with a fork. But when he came back, I'm sure De Valera must have realized that this is something he cannot bring back on his own. He needs to put together a proper delegation and go negotiating with the British delegation that will be sitting around the table. I think a major mistake was the fact that the Irish agreed to a meeting down the street, HQ of your enemy.
Yeah.
But it should have been done on neutral ground. We discussed that. I won't go into any more. The second thing is the delegates, the British would have been more experienced because they would have had the previous negotiation skills, in Versailles and all of that. Mm-hmm. So the Irish delegation was basically made up of, first of all, Michael Collins. We know who Michael Collins is. He was actually, would you believe it, Michael Collins was seen as the moderate side of Sinn Féin, would you believe it? Amongst the Irish at home now, from a British point of view, he would have been seen as hardliner, the most wanted man, I say, in the empire at the time, not Ireland and Britain. And amongst his own, he was seen as a moderate. You had Arthur Griffith, who was the founder of Sinn Féin, because the British still had this misperceived image of the 1916 Rising being called the Sinn Féin Rising, when Sinn Féin actually had nothing to do with it. It was actually a giant IRB, Irish Citizen Army operation with members of the Irish Volunteers as men on the ground, when Sinn Féin had absolutely nothing to do with it. So here was this enigma, Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins coming over, negotiation with the representatives of the British Empire. Michael Collins set up Sinn Féin in 1905, which was an organization born out of what was called the Fermanagh clubs, which was moderate Northern Protestant constitutional thinking Presbyterians in Church of Ireland, who were aspiring to that old United Irishmen of Protestants and Catholics working together for an Ireland freedom. Contrary to what Sinn Féin would be seen as standing from, as totally and exclusively a Northern Irish, and he's a very strong base here in the southern, in the south now as well, but kind of that exclusive from the nationalist side. So the Sinn Féin had a very different founding at the time, but however, he was the two guys coming to it. Griffith, being an elderly statesman, seen as the old constitution, like bringing the constitutional side of the Republican movement to the table. And as I say, Collins was bringing the army and the IRB. And remember now, De Valera is picking the team. This is not something they agreed between themselves. So they were trying to bring all the different groupings, ideologies, power plays within the organization and send them over. You had Eamon Duggan, who was selected for his legal experience. You had Robert Barton. Robert Barton and Duggan, they were actually Dave's men. They were seen as hardliners, or were perceived as hardliners at the time. And they were there to balance the moderates of Collins and Griffith, believe it or not. Now, they also brought with them a delegation, within a delegation, a whole lot of secretaries and all of that behind the actual scenes. It wasn't just the 5 or 6 men going over. They all stayed in the one building, but Collins stayed in his own separate building. He brought his own crew of trusted IRB personnel with him. And and that alone will tell you that there was division within the Irish delegation. Even before they started, there was mistrust between members of the Irish delegation and Collins. Why would Collins, from their point of view, want his own building, his own secretary, his own bodyguards on the doors and all that? Now, believe it or not, the bodyguards were there to protect him for his own interests, but he was also, I'm sure these guys were well aware they were being bugged and watched and monitored and spied upon every minute, second of the day. They were quite aware of that. So to move on to the Irish side, Erskine Childers was also one of the people that spoke.
They spoke, and Collins himself, they spoke in Irish a lot when they were there.
Yes.
When they weren't at the formal meetings.
Yes, and there was a lot of backroom meetings going on as well. Because one of the things the British did, and what Lyle George did, it was a deliberate ploy, and this is where the reputation of the Welsh Wizard really kicked in. He actually proposed that the Irish delegation should break it up into subcommittees, and they provided rooms in the back of Downing Street for they to discuss elements and articles of the proposed treaty, which I'll get into, because the three main areas that they discussed was defence, Irish unity, and the Republic versus Dominion status. And what he was actually doing without the Irish didn't really realize it, I reckon, was he had the headliners inside negotiation, the easy bit, while he had the moderates outside negotiation, the difficult bits. So he was kind of playing them off as well, and this is where the experience comes against the inexperience, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
On the British side, the delegation consists of Lyle George, who was the leader of the Liberal Party. You could say he was one of the great victors of World War One, the giants of world politics at the time, one of the top four. Winston Churchill, later Prime Minister, who was Secretary of State of the colonists, which Ireland was seen as at the time, although he was disgraced only 2 years previously when he was dismissed from his naval portfolio as a result of his debacle below in Gallipoli.
Yeah.
We had Lord Birkenhead, leader of the Unionist wing of the Tories, and who was Lord Chancellor. Now, Lord Birkenhead was brought in to represent the hardline Unionists within the Conservative Party. As I explained, the Conservative Party, given his full title, is the Conservative Party of Britain and Unionist Party of Britain and Northern Ireland. Because Lyle George was the head of the Liberals, there was two political parties that was holding the government together. You had factions within the British side as well, which he had to keep tabs on, because first and foremost, he had to keep unity within his own government. He couldn't give or be seen giving the Irish anything that would rock the boat and bust up his own government.
No.
We had Austin Chamberlain, who was the leader of the House of Commons at the time, who was actually a brother of Neville Chamberlain, quite a staunch Tory, quite a staunch Unionist supporter as well, even though you wouldn't get that impression by the behaviour of his brother later, because irony is that it was his brother who actually agreed to the letting go of the three treaty ports that was negotiated by his brother in the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the irony.
Yeah.
You had Sir Laming Irvington Evans, and he was the Secretary of State of War. You had Sir Gordon Hubert, who was the Attorney General, and you had Sir Hammer Greenwood, the Chief Secretary of Ireland. So quite a number of heavyweights around the table, which the Irish delegation came face to face. So, and as I said, the Irish side, Robert Barton was actually another gentleman I've got to mention. Robert Barton was the Secretary of State of Economics within the Dáil Éireann, and a very, very staunch Republican as well. Like he would be seen as a heavyweight and one of Dave's picked men. Eamon Duggan and George Gavin Duffy were both Chapter Dáil and members of the elected. One was in Dublin, the other was in Meath, I recall, if I stand to be corrected on that. And
Robert Barton became an MP for Kildare, Wicklow.
Was it? Yeah. Well, I'm on about Duggan and Duffy.
Duffy
that's right. Barton was down in Wicklow.
Duffy was South County Dublin.
Yeah.
And
technically, Collins was a TD, you could say, and he was Minister for Finance.
He was. He always looked after the money.
Yeah, he was definitely the money man. I mean, he was the brains and the intelligence and the man behind the famous national loan, which was one of the first acts they did. They were released from Frankop in 1917.
That's right, yeah, that's right. Collins did that, yeah.
So, and
Robert Barton, to me, he was carrying on the tradition. I don't mean to belittle that in no way belittles him now the way I'm describing it. If people are taking it up that way, Robert Barton to me was carrying on the tradition of well-known. He was an Irish nationalist politician, but he was a big farmer as well, and carrying on the tradition of what we call non-Catholic people. For instance, the tradition of Wolfe Tone, tradition of people like that, who saw the injustices that were perpetrated, even though they would be Church of Ireland or Protestant. They saw it. They saw the injustice, and he became, as I said to you, he ran for, and they owned that huge house, Barton's Glendalough House.
That's right.
In Wicklow, which has been seen in many films down through the years. That's Glendalough House. In Braveheart, shot a few scenes around Glendalough House to mention fairly recent film. He was educated in Rugby and Oxford. That's Robert Barton. And as I say, he won a seat in the 1918 elections for Kildare Wicklow. And after he was defeated in the 1923 election, he retired from politics. It's it's ironic that he died in 1975 at the age of 94. I know it jumped ahead. And 19 days later, De Valera died.
I didn't realize.
Robert Barton was the last living signatory of the treaty, and he died in 1975 at the age of 94. And De Valera, as we know, died 19 days later.
And he was also the first minister for forestry. And
yes,
he practiced a lot of the new ideas that went on to be the foundation stone lead for the Department of Forestry in the first Irish Free State government right down to this day, and practiced them on his own land at home.
He did. Barton was a very interesting character. We could do a whole program, and you know, he's getting back to Robert Barton. His father obviously was William Barton, but his mother was the Childers. His mother was Agnes Childers,
who was related to Escon Childers.
Exactly. So there you go.
Also based in Wicklow. They had a house in Wicklow as well.
Exactly. So
and the Childers were then related to the Stoddart family, which owned Bunratty Castle, only out the road from Limerick here.
That's right. Yeah. So there we are, and we're flying around the country. We're doing a tour of a
genealogical tour of the signatories of the
He was chairman as well.
And that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
There are two staunch Republicans on the Irish side who are members of the Church of Ireland. And
absolutely
more staunch and more Republican than their counterparts who were Catholic.
Right. And he was
going to be anti-treaty after.
Yeah.
Their life.
As I said, and as we mentioned in the last program about George Gavin Duffy, who was born in Cheshire in England as well, and educated and all of that. As I said, he came over here and settled here, as you rightly said, Michael, and he became a complete, not convert, but a complete follower and supporter, because through his legal practice, he saw the complete injustice and unjust way that society was ordered in this country at the time, or disordered, for the want of a better word, disorganized and prejudiced by the British Empire being part of it. He didn't see any good in being part of that empire going forward. That's George Gavin Duffy. And so did Robert Barton, in my opinion, anyway, you know. They saw the mistreatment of people who didn't deserve that.
Yeah.
For the want of a better word.
Anyway, getting into the treaty itself, when the Irish delegation arrived in London for the actual talks, now that the two sides were handpicked and sent over, they were met with huge crowds in London. And one of the strange little unknown stories that happened on the morning of the arrival of the Irish, before the Irish delegation arrived in Downing Street, there was thousands upon thousands of Irish people right outside Downing Street. And it must have been more open at the time, because I remember my first time going up to Downing Street in 1997 when I was in London.
Yeah.
You have to keep a long way away now. You know, you
wouldn't get near the place.
At the time, you could literally go right up to the door. So obviously, those was a little more lapsed at the time. But there was an old, small Irish woman with a shawl standing in front of the door, and she asked to meet Lloyd George that morning. And Lloyd George actually came out to the door, and he asked her what did she want. She said, "I want to see the chairs that Irish delegation are going to sit on." And the most unusual thing happened was that actually Lloyd George brought her into the Downing Street.
Oh yeah.
Into the room where the treaty negotiations were going to begin, and she produces this small bottle with a cap and takes out the bottle, and she starts sprinkling the chair and the chairs that the Irish delegation were going to sit on with holy water. At first he was bemused, and then he kind of was, what's going on here? What am I out to allowing here? Because this would not be his religious
No, no,
tradition.
no, no.
And then she asked him, and where are you going to sit, Mr. Prime Minister? And he pointed to the chair over the other side. And she went over and she drowned his chair with holy water. And he said, what are you doing that for? And she said, that's to keep the devil away from the two of you, that we'll have peace in Ireland between our two countries.
Fair play, sir.
And there was a bit of respect in him, as in her motives.
Yes.
He respected her motive, maybe not how she went about it, but her motive. And he escorted her out to the door and thanked her for her time. And then the Irish delegation came. And believe it or not, there was dozens of people outside across the road kneeling down, praying the rosary. Talk about change of times for the peace. And the police had to literally line the cars to the door to let the Irish delegation in. Such was the interest in seeing these people for the first time. So when they went in anyway, they sat down, they got going, and the three main areas for discussion was defence, Irish unity, and the Republic versus Dominion status. I'll go into those points now. Firstly, you would think actually the defence would be actually a
Not.
pressure, but it was actually the easiest one of the three, and was agreed upon fairly quickly. And what the British and Irish agreed was that they would set up an Irish army. They would say the British Navy would be responsible for Irish naval protection until such time as the Irish would have their own navy. However, they wanted the three treaty ports, which was Queenstown, Bearhaven, and Lough Swilly up alongside Derry. And the Irish agreed to those, had no issue with those. And part of the agreement was that the British would use them in time of war. And the Irish were left under no illusion. They had no issue there because only shortly beforehand, the British were using these ports to counteract the submarine U-boat menace
of the First World War,
of the Germans during World War One.
Yeah.
And it was the lack of those ports that Churchill grieved during World War Two, and was his main reason why he made these overtures to Mr. De Valera, as he used to refer to him as, during the early days of World War II. They really lacked those because, I mean, one of the biggest battles of all of World War II, and the longest one, was the Battle of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And they would have been pinnacle to it had they had access to it.
So the appalling
loss of life
loss of merchant shipping and civilians.
And Irish merchant shipping during World War II. There was
there's been so many people killed. They had nothing to do with the war. In one way, they were killed by U-boats in the First World War, just going about their business and trying to move goods around the place and so forth. There was a huge amount of people killed. There was a commemoration every year, I think, up in Dunleary, is it? I think it's held in Dunleary. It's held by the Merchant Seamen's Association, whatever they're called, you know. And that's a very important one. And you'd hear all the harrowing stories of people, you know. Yeah. Was the Lusitania the Second World War?
No, the Lusitania was 1919,
was it?
1917.
Yeah, the Lusitania was.
I had a relative on that. I had a relative on the Titanic.
Yeah.
And I had a relative.
Oh yeah, on the Lusitania was sank not far off the Irish coast.
Yeah.
You know.
1915. So it's 1915.
Right. Was it 1915?
So 2 years before America entered the war, and it was the reason America used to join the war. And as many critics of America's late entry into World War II said, why did it take them 2 years to make up their mind when the Lusitania was sunk, but when their ships were sunk in Hawaii, they made up their mind straight away. in the next war.
Exactly. That was, oh,
So
well, they did.
there was the whole
There was,
the telegram from the Germans to Mexico and all of that. There's a whole lot of other stuff. We're not going to go there. Back to the treaty anyway.
Back to the treaty before that. When did Michael Collins encounter Lady Lavery? This famous Lady Lavery.
I understand while he was in London, in and out between the negotiations. I believe he even got his portrait painted by her
He did.
husband.
That's right.
And of course, the Lady Lavery later went on to be the iconic photo in what we call the Fiver. When
The old pound note as well.
Yeah.
But wasn't she? No, there's speculation, Michael.
I know.
There's always speculation when a man and a woman spend a lot of time in each other's company, so to speak, for the want of a better description. I think she was well taken by Michael Collins. She was.
Many were, and not getting into that now, but many people were taken by his personality when they met him. And even it has to be admitted, historians have recorded through the private diaries of some of the British delegation. By all accounts, Lord Birkenhead and Collins, while totally opposite on paper, totally opposite him, like Collins was seen as the head of the terrorist IRA, while Birkenhead was seen as the most staunch representative of the units in Northern Ireland. They became great friends. They had great respect, and apparently used to have many a drink after negotiations were finished on the better.
There's loads of stories about Birkenhead and Collins, loads of them,
stories,
on a human level as well,
of course,
and respect, of course, yeah.
And by all accounts, Birkenhead was saddened on hearing of his death.
Oh yes,
because he felt he was a man. He felt he was a man that he could negotiate with, but he was a man that would have kept his side of the bargain.
Yeah, well, I think now you hit the nail on the head. Collins was a man of his word.
Yeah.
And it was a terrible position, I think, myself. I think fairly early on in the talks, I think Collins had a realization. I think he knew pretty early on in those negotiations that the 32 County Republic was utterly and totally out. Gone, forget it. And he, being the pragmatist that he was, I think, he said, okay, what's the best we can do here now today is 26 counties. We leave the others aside for another day. We go back and we can certainly work on that when we get back. I think that was his approach because, look, that's all was on offer. And I think that those things had been decided in those talks with De Valera and Lloyd George. I'm not saying there's no basis historically for it. I'm just saying it looks logical to me that framework was already decided before the delegation came over. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
There isn't any historical evidence for that, but the document, I think, is the evidence, a correlation of what went on beforehand. I don't know. It makes sense to me anyway. That's how I make sense of it.
Yeah.
Michael.
But moving on anyway to the second main point of the topics that was up for discussion during the treaty is the whole Irish unity. Was it 26 county republic or was it 32? As I said, the 1920, the Government of Ireland Act of Northern Ireland was set up, was in place. And what we don't realize is there was a de facto government, a devolved government to be more precise, in operation there. So
installment
kind of got one up on the Irish even before they ever got to the table, where they had the Northern Ireland stateless up, going, running. So lads, it's not up for discussion. What are you on about? Kind of approach to the Irish delegation. Of course, that had his own connotations. James Craig was, as I say, was not asked to the negotiations because James Craig, I gather, did not have any patience. Ironically, a Dublin-born man, he had no liking whatsoever, even for wanting to meet these guys was Birkenhead, and he didn't, while he was the leader of Northern Ireland, he didn't bring all the parties or hand the connections within the British as Lord Birkenhead had. At all, Lord Birkenhead came from that kind of higher class. He
Yeah.
could bring his own peers within the upper and lower houses of parliament in the UK, whereas Craig was just seen as a little upstart from Dublin,
Yeah.
a very good solicitor while he was at it. I believe he was even Attorney General during the World War One government in Britain, but after the war was over, he took a step down and just decided to, from 1920, to take on the role as leader of Northern Ireland. Yes, he was Attorney General for the British government during World War One. He was.
Yeah.
Then you had what really became the bone of contention for all parties. I said that the British broke up the Irish delegation into these commissions and subcommittees. And one of the days of negotiations was there were negotiations with Griffith one day on his own. This is Lloyd George and Griffith now. And Lloyd George proposed what went on to be the infamous Border Commission. And the idea was thrown out that Northern Ireland, as the 6 counties that it is today, and from Tyrone, Armagh, Derry, and Fermanagh, that they would get back 2 of the counties, Fermanagh and Armagh, West End to be corrected, and a whole section of parts of South County down the Peninsula, Derry, which is literally 90% Catholic, and a whole area around Derry, and the rest then would be more of a stronger unionist dominated Northern Ireland of the 4 counties, or what's left of the 4 counties.
Yeah.
As he said himself, a Protestant state for a Protestant people.
That's right.
And that played into getting Griffith to agree on this in principle. And while Griffin understood he was agreeing to it in principle, Lloyd George later alluded that he agreed to it as part of the overall agreement. So there's this mind game going on between the 2 of them. And he issued a letter, what we would call today a draft letter, on his proposal on the Boundary Commission and their respective ideas, and they agreed on a kind of broad what they agreed on.
Right.
And that letter became vital later, because near the end of the negotiations, when there was nearly a breakdown and Collins and Griffith were taking a very strong stand.
Yeah, they were.
Lloyd George pulled out, like a rabbit out of a hat, this letter that he had given to Griffith.
Yeah.
And Griffith had not discussed this with any of the delegation. And when the letter was pushed across the table to Michael Collins from Lloyd George, what's his name? Not Duggan, Barton whispered into Collins's ear, "What the hell is this?" And he, Collins in a very low whisper said he hadn't a clue. So when Collins read the letter, Lloyd George told him that Mr. Griffith has already agreed to this. And I don't know, can you say fair dues, or was he gobsmacked to Michael Collins? Well, Michael Collins made absolutely no comment. He remained silent.
Well, he had to remain silent.
He remained silent, but they didn't want to show division.
No. Yeah.
And he wasn't going to hang out his close comrade. And it probably did shock you to absorb it. And what's not said, you don't have to retract.
Exactly. But getting back to that, that letter, as we said in the beginning, or I said myself, the duplicitous nature of politics carried out by the British, no matter what country they were in. This is one sorry example. There's one certain thing. If you don't want to do anything about a problem, for instance, like Northern Ireland, the border, if you don't want to do anything or get nothing done, you set up a commission. You set up a commission that can meet forever and do nothing. That's what you do. And we still have that today.
Oh,
When
right.
politicians are in trouble, when politics are in trouble, when governments are in trouble, what do? They set up a commission or an inquiry.
Yeah.
And that is code for, lads, we're going to do nothing about this for a while anyway. And if we're questioned, we'll say, look,
It was also buying time. It's also
but it's also a situation whereby they cannot and don't want to be held accountable. So they can always say when Michael or Pat will ask them a question about what's happening about the golf gate, we'll say, whatever it is, there's a commission of inquiry going on, and I cannot comment at this time as it would interfere with that blah, 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 blah. And you have this absolute example of the letter, as you said, pulled out. And Arthur Griffith, I don't care what anybody says about Arthur Griffith. There is no way in the wide earthly world would that man agree to anything like that without it being discussed fully.
Oh, he was set up. He was set up. He was absolutely set up. And he was too honourable a man then
to say he was.
He was a very, very honourable man. Historians have since, and particularly when we get into the Civil War and the lead up to the Civil War and what we call the anti-treaty side within Dáil
yeah,
he tried to take him to pieces on this issue. They tried to take him to pieces. Why did he agree? He was seen as, to quote the words of Ian Pacey decades later, as a sellout, literally.
Yeah.
But the British played this one beautifully because if you know anything about the Border Commission, it was a complete farce that went on to 1925. And even the layout of the delegation, where they had there was 3 members, one from the south, he was McDougall's granduncle, Owen O'Neill. You had a representative from the north of Ireland, and then you had a representative from England. So whatever the outcome, there's going to be a 2-1 decision anyway. So the 26th County Free State Republic, whatever you want to call it, was never going to get his aspirations in the boundary anyway. So it was,
as we said, Michael, it was a commission is an instrument to do nothing.
To do nothing.
To do nothing.
They came down the road, as we would say.
Look at all the inquiries we've had ourselves in this half country of ours. Look at all the inquiries we've had down through the years. You can get tomes of them in any library and findings made of those commissions of inquiry and no action taken.
No. So anyway, getting back to the third main area, it's that was up for discussion is the Republic versus the Dominion status.
Yes.
Now, when the delegation was sent over by Eamon de Valera, he gave them a list of certain things to adhere to.
Right.
And I just want to bring this in because it's a very, very important point, particularly when the fallout comes post return of the
delegation,
signatures. They want to communicate with Dublin the whole time, and those letters sent over and back on the famous Holt mailboat. I believe you send a letter at night to be there by morning, or vice versa.
Yes.
Was as good as a service anywhere in the world at the time.
Yeah.
Now, many historians have asked since, why did they not communicate on the telephone?
We know why.
First of all, I'm sure they were able to listen in on it. But even if they were or they were not listening to it, it was one of these old telephones you put up to your ear and you do the dial-up. You didn't have a speakerphone. If one person was speaking, if there was any sort of crackle at all, there was no guarantee that what was received at the other end, what was said at one end, and that was clearly demonstrated in 1914 in the countdown to what was called the 37 days of diplomacy between Britain and Germany that led to World War I. There was this infamous telephone call made between Germany and what's his name, Mr. Gray. He was from the foreign diplomacy in the UK government at the time, and both said the one thing, but there's two complete misinterpretations because there was a crackle on the line. So maybe on that point of view, they weren't using the telephone. Number two, as we said, it could be both. But number three, it was not in their nature terrain because you were dealing with a former secret organization that just did not use phones.
No, they never did.
They literally carried the letters on person from A to B, and that thing took time. So there was all that factored in, but there was a definitely a set of instructions that nothing was to be agreed in London without any discussions being discussed about it back in Dublin in the Dáil in the Mansion House.
Yes.
And that was kind of kept going. Those letters being sent over on a nightly basis and letters being received on a daily basis. But the British were realizing this, that there was a time delay between any decision the Irish would make on any proposal from the British. So they knew they had to get them into a corner. And of course, the one they really got into a corner over was the Dominican status and the Republic. Britain was under no circumstances given a republic. The Dominion status was something they only saw themselves, which was Ireland would be fulfilling a role within the British Commonwealth, similar to Australia, Canada, New Zealand. Yeah. So as you could argue, India or South Africa at the time.
Yeah.
And basically, David Everything came up with a new version of this. Instead of Dominion status, he came up with a phrase that even himself couldn't explain later in the Dáil during the treaty debates, where he had to retract the draft proposal. He called it external association within the Commonwealth, which neither the British or the Irish couldn't even explain or understand.
Well, when you say there, external association within, external and within,
I don't match.
Immediately you say to yourself, so you'll have external association. In order to have that, you must be outside. You can't be inside, within. That's Fianna Fáil for you, as men would say, Michael. Is that the beginning of the? Is that the beginning of the Noble Party? Is it external association? External association from within.
Yes, yes.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it was basically a formula within a formula. It was another kind of phrase of his. And again, all this goes back to his infamous 4 meetings. He knew what he couldn't get. And he was talking in riddles. And basically, the guys were there with a cold face, sitting down in front of the heavyweights, representing the British Empire. And they're trying to get as good and as a deal as they actually could.
They did very well as it transpired.
You could argue with that in hindsight. Particularly, I always take the point of view where I like to give the benefit of the doubt, where particularly when I'm reading what Arthur Griffith said, that like he was not going to be the last Irishman of his generation, there'll be many more generations of Irishmen. Neither was this going to be the first and last treaty. There was
exactly.
They were going to break it down. And particularly, if you go into the period between the Civil War and the Cumann na Gael defeat in 1932, which is a 9-year period, those 2 Free State governments were very active within the Commonwealth, and they broke down many of the other areas that they couldn't break down on the day of the treaty. They actually got a lot of those minor little blockages removed legally and got the support of the other members of the Commonwealth on their side.
Yes.
And got them to agree and was seen as very forward and active within the Asian nations of the.
Of course, we have to look at the other scenario, which I always took the view that and it's always easier in this remove from then to now to say something definite when you're not there yourself, if you follow my drift.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that the treaty itself should have never been accepted at all by anybody on the Irish side. They should have just, that's it, we'll come back again, good luck. It should never have been brought anywhere out of that room. That's my opinion, looking back at it.
So just to move on to the end of the actual treaty negotiations that
Yeah.
were going on from the early October, November, and December.
Right into
Now,
December, yeah.
yeah, now we are coming up to the early days of the December, and basically they're coming to a crunch.
Yeah.
When after this letter that was produced by Lloyd George about the Boundary Commission, Lloyd George decides just to put a quick one where he did his famous theatrical act. He produced the two letters.
The rabbit out of the hat,
And
yeah.
on this letter, I'm going to send a letter to Mr. Craig in Northern Ireland. And on this letter, I was going to send one to the British Army to release them after 72 hours. He was going to release hell on the Irish and release something they had never seen before. And he basically called their bluff, and he said the train is already running in Euston Station in London. So Griffith had agreed that he would sign, and even Mr. Lloyd George asked him, if no one else signed on your delegation, would you sign? He said, yes, Mr. Prime Minister, I give my word. On the understanding of what he had only understood in relation to the Boundary Commission.
All right.
Wallenstein, they were given till 9 o'clock that night, was it the 4th, to the 4th of December, they were given to 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock came, 9 o'clock went, no sign of the Irish delegation. 10 o'clock came, 10 o'clock went, and the Irish didn't turn up till next morning, and they said they needed a bit of time. They turned up eventually. They sat down in front of them, and they had a few more issues where Arthur Griffith really goes in and articulates all the different grievances. To make
Yes, that's right.
They eventually signed that 10 to 2 in the morning on the 5th of December 1921, where each of the 7 delegations signed. The British signed on the left-hand side and the Irish signed on the right-hand side. Just a one-pager after it all. It came down to one pager.
Couple of lines, yeah.
Couple of lines. And would you believe it, as we're both in Limerick recording this episode, Limerick City was the first place in Ireland where the word came that the treaty was signed. And Mr. De Valera was in Ireland reviewing IRA, or would you call it the National Army, as they were starting to call themselves at the time.
That's right, yeah. Inspecting them.
Inspecting troops here in Limerick.
Yeah.
And he arrived into a house on the Strand, one of the ex-Lord Mayors that was killed in Limerick at the time. The telegram arrived there. I think it was Gerard O'Sullivan was the man who first read it in Ireland, or got the word treaty signed. That was
That's all was on it, was it?
Or the treaty signed, or something just very, very short.
Yeah.
Sullivan received it on the Monday night. And De Valera took the train into Dublin the following day to reconvene the Dáil. And believe it or not, who was with De Valera going up on that train, and they were to become arch enemies in the Civil War, was Richard Mulcahy.
Oh, yeah.
And they were actually, literally took over a whole compartment to themselves. But there's a very somber feeling about the whole thing, because while everybody knew the treaty was signed, no one knew what was signed or what they had agreed to.
Well, the contents of the treaty, obviously, wasn't revealed until fully, and all the nuances of it until all the lads came back and had a full debate.
And a full day went, and the following day at 8 p.m., it was verbally agreed between both delegations that the treaty would be published at the same time in Britain and Ireland. And when it was released, usually any of the newspapers, the press, would go to press at 9 p.m. So all the big ones, the Irish Press, and all those, sorry, not the Irish Press, the Irish Times and those, they all didn't even mention it in the publication next morning. The only paper to basically give them mention that was signed was the Freeman's Journal, believe it or not.
Yeah.
The Mansion House then was adjourned. They all mentioned the Mansion House the following day, and when they actually read the
Text.
the main text of the treaty, immediately decides, you could see the pro and the anti-treaty sides were actually starting to come about. I won't go into that. I think that's another discussion. The post.
It is, yeah. But there was, I mean,
what I would like to say is just the facts around the actual treaty. On the 7th of January in 1922, which was literally the first week of reconvening the Dáil in after Christmas, because we were in the lead up to Christmas here, the Dáil voted in favour of 57 to 64 for the
to accept the treaty.
Like a treaty. And
the Dáil did, yeah.
And the British Parliament 47 voted against, and something like 457 voted for. That wasn't surprising.
10 to 1. Well, 10 to 1. But anyway, they wanted the problem, as they saw it, they wanted the problem solved in any way. They didn't really care about the final points. They wanted
it solved.
They just wanted it out of their hair. But in Ireland, in the Dáil debate that time, Michael, in the first Dáil debate and the voting on the, I think we'll finish it at the Dáil debate, will we? And we'll
I think so. Yeah, because at that 15 days.
At that Dáil debate, when they took the vote, and it was carried by 7 votes, 64-57, I think, was it? 7 votes. In any case, it was passed by our national parliament at the time. And De Valera did say, if the parliament passes this treaty, we are all bound to accept it. De Valera did say that. It has to go to the Dáil, and we'll be bound by the decision of the Dáil. Sorry.
On the understanding that he thought his side would win.
Oh, well, apart from that, he made that statement. So therefore, the treaty was, the point I'm getting at is this. The treaty was voted on democratically and voted for. He walked out of the Dáil, didn't he?
He did. And he led his delegation after the vote, and the 57, he and 56 delegates left, and they literally walked out of constitutional politics until 1927, the formation of Fianna Fáil.
Isn't that a good note to bring this?
No, just one more.
Yeah.
It's very important to mention, there's one very important point I want to mention. Out of the 15 days, they discuss the
treaty
of the treaty. Many women spoke during it. Patrick Pearse's mother spoke. Terence McSweeney's wife spoke.
That's right.
There was another hunger strike whose name.
She did.
His widow spoke as well. Every single woman was against the treaty. Many of them cried. Many of them said that if the sons and husbands died, well, if more have to die, so be it. But De Valera cried. He became emotional. Griffith, I think, got quite emotional too. But 3% of the total 15 days of talks only discussed the border. The whole issue with him was he wasn't a republic as they fought for 1916, and taking the oath was actually the biggest issue of all. Not the border.
Well, obviously, you're right. The border didn't figure at all. I read some of the debates. As you said, the border.
Yeah.
So it was the oath of allegiance, and the fact that they didn't get the republic we fought so bloody well for. But anyway, so be it. But we'll be coming back to this, Michael, no doubt about it. And
on that note.
Yeah, we leave that, Michael, and it's been a fantastic eye-opener. Hopefully the viewers that will be catching up on this program, just remember that we're not professional historians. We're interested
no,
in history, which
no
we're
problem.
endeavoring to instill a love of history into anybody who's looking into this in light of next year, 1921, being a very important year in our celebrations.
And on that note, I like this is
So,
the hour for the past and a week, and I'd like to thank Pat for your contributions. Definitely has been a very informative hour. I really enjoyed it. And in our next hour talk or whatever we'll do is catch up again. We'll continue on in the post-treaty and that interim period between the treaty and the unfortunate episode of the Civil War. So I'd like to thank you all who have been listening to us, and goodbye from Pat and goodbye from me. Thank you.
bye-bye till we see you again.